So welcome everybody to our first lunchtime talk of the semester. It's my pleasure to welcome Piers Stevens here from the University of Georgia, where he's professor of philosophy. He's also the editor of the journal Ethics and the Environment.
That's correct.
Yeah, all right. And without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to him to present his talk on William James and environmental philosophy.
Lovely. Thank you very much indeed. And first of all, I'd like to say how grateful I am and happy I am to be here at the Dewey Centre. It's a place which I heard a great deal over the years. I first became involved in pragmatist philosophy when living on the other side of the Atlantic, as I'm British, you can probably tell. I know how very significant this venue has been for the development of modern practice scholarship. So it's a great honour to be here, and I'm very grateful for the invitation. Okay, now what I'm going to present to you today is essentially the outlines of a book project that I have ongoing. I'm going to conclude actually with a few questions, some of your expert advice on how I should actually try and finish the thing. But I'll take you mostly with through the development of the arguments I'm going to be making. The proposed book is going to be called Pragmatic Ecologism, subtitled William James and Environmental Philosophy. And ecologism is a term that's sometimes used to indicate in environmental thought a more, should we say, radical end of the environmentalist spectrum. And what I want to, part of what I want to show is that a pragmatic naturalist framework can in fact do a lot of the supportive philosophical work that environmental ethicists want, but that it has traditionally been thought capable of doing. And I think that a big difference here can be made by adopting James rather than Dewey. Apologies to Students. So I'll start off by with a quick, as chapter 1 is going to start off, with a quick sort of overview of the current situation in environmental philosophy. It's commonly, it's a common assumption that environmental philosophy, or environmental ethics as it's often known institutionally, is thought of as primarily a moralist, an anti-instrumentalist, and an anti-anthropocentrist perspective. And those traits are habitually taken as being incompatible, or at least hard to square with the pragmatist tradition. So an early anti-pragmatist text from Eugene Hargrove, Foundation of Environmental Ethics, he says, pragmatism with its stress on instrumental values and its disdain for intrinsic values is, through the conservation philosophy of Gifford Pinchot, responsible for the conversion of natural objects into instrumental triggers for the generation of aesthetic pleasures in the minds of humans. This conversion runs counter to the more traditional view that objects of beauty are valuable for their own sake without regard to their use. And subsequent critiques of the pragmatist tradition have tended to cast it as being fundamentally instrumentalist and or anthropocentric, or at the very least to be unhelpful for or incompatible with any sort of non-instrumental appreciation or valuation of non-human nature. So the critiques from famously Baird Callicott in his debate with Brian Norton, Katie McShane, Lars Samuelson, more recently, Piers 10 years ago in the pages of environmental values. That is a commonplace claim, and I think one of the reasons why it's a commonplace claim is because the way in which most of the proponents of environmental pragmatism and advancement has rather stressed the areas of the field which unfortunately are probably not that conducive, or the aspects of the tradition that are not that conducive to environmentalist motivations. What I want to argue in part is that in the dispute between environmental pragmatists and anti-pragmatists within environmental philosophy, both sides are actually right about something. But they're not necessarily right about the things they think they're right about. What the anti-pragmatists are right about is that it is quite foundational to much of the to many environmental thinkers and activists to think of relationships with the non-human natural world as being importantly anti-instrumental. That is to say, not to think of them purely as items of manipulation or stimulus. Right? And if you look at sort of like many of the stories of people who have had conversions to environmentalism, this sort of experience is very, very frequent. Right? Whether it's gazing into the eyes of a not-human creature, or sort of like being sort of silenced by the beauty of an orchid, or gazing up at the night sky. Well, all of these things give essentially to trigger sensations that are not best captured in terms of instrumental rationality. So I think the anti-pragmatists are right about that is something that's important to most environmental thinkers, but they are wrong to say that the pragmatist tradition, the pragmatic naturalist tradition, more precisely, cannot incorporate them. I use the term pragmatic naturalism to describe the union of the pragmatist tradition with the radical empiricist tradition. But I think they are wrong to suppose that pragmatism can't take that on. Environmental pragmatists, meanwhile, I think have, well, not say that they're wrong, but I think there has been a tendency to make what I regard as being a tactical error, which is to put the instrumentalist or the policy side of pragmatism and the action-based side of the pragmatist tradition front and center. Now, it's not that, of course, we are going to have to do those things. There's going to have to be environmental policy, and that is going to necessarily involve the use of certain sorts of instrumental category and analysis and so forth. I'm not against that. What I am saying is that this tendency to stress that side has sidelined issues that are at least as important. So a brief outline of the various ways in which environmental pragmatism tend to be promoted within environmental philosophy. So firstly, there's thought of it operating as a strategy for bridging the environmental theory practice gap. That was Andrew Light's best known for that, as advocating that position. Then there's pragmatism as a neglected historical tradition in American environmental thought and praxis. That's mostly associated with Ben McTeer, though Paul Thompson is also a part of that. Perhaps most famously, most significantly, Brian Norton's work on pragmatism as a unifying force for environmental policy goals and for environmental management. Fourthly, less well known on this side of the Atlantic, but significant nonetheless, pragmatism as a tool in understanding necessary versus damaging understandings of human alienation from non-human nature. So Simon Halewood has pushed that forward at book length in his book Alienation from Nature, Human Nature and Alienation. Sorry. Then fifth, this is the position that I'm closest to, that advanced by Anthony Weston, which is pragmatism as a source of inspiration for reconstructing problems in environmental ethics and practice. And finally, the position most associated with Erin McKenna, that I'd like to be known as well, pragmatism as a source of direct ethical guiding assistance for dealings with non-human animals. Those, I think, have been the major ways in which this has been conceived. I'll make sort of 3 points about that. Firstly, the best-known advocate, as I mentioned, as Brian Norton, is focused on policy and management, and the I'm not against what Norton is trying to do, but I do think that it has had an unfortunate side effect, which has been that Norton's managerialism, which incidentally in the past decade he has moved back somewhat, walked back somewhat, and has attempted to enrich with more appeals to the experiential. But Norton's managerialism has often been taken by critics who have not read deeply in the pragmatist traditions as embodying the core meaning and orientation of the whole tradition. And of course, given the anti-instrumentalist orientation of a lot of environmentalists, that's going to make it unsurprising that non-pragmatist environmentalists look at environmental pragmatist allies and see enemies instead of supporters. Secondly, the historical examinations have seldom been as clearly linked up to contemporary environmental practice as they might have been. And this is unfortunate because, as Benjamin Tier has argued, there's actually a pretty strong evidence of an earlier strand of distinctive American environmentalism in the New Deal era, which can be drawn upon. Although there's a very disproportionate emphasis in the literature on the work of John Dewey, and a little bit of work by Light and Hale, which is drawn on Rorty instead. But there's been very little and almost nothing on William James. To the best of my knowledge, I'm the only person who's actually published more than one article on James' environmental philosophy. So there seems to be an unsupported assumption that anything good in James can also be found present and improved in Dewey. And I think this is a mistake, both factually and in terms of the respective thinkers and focis. I think James's thought not only offers insights that are lacking in Dewey's, or at least underplayed in Dewey's, but it can suggest something more radical for environmental pragmatism that's populated. And that really is the project of the book. So the second chapter is going to be about essentially why has William James been neglected? And I think it's been neglected because there are a range of myths. One of which I've already touched upon was the myth that anything in James could be found in better form in Dewey. But I'll go through a couple of others as well. One that has faded out of practice in recent years, but which nonetheless is still running, is the myth of the myth that James doesn't have much to say about ethics and politics. On this view, James was primarily concerned with epistemology and psychology and philosophy of religion. And he wasn't terribly interested in ethics or politics as compared to Dewey. But this view has been pretty comprehensively refuted over the past decade and a half. Now, it's true that James only wrote one systematic essay that was specifically targeted towards moral philosophy, namely the moral philosophy of the moral life. But ethical, political, and religious concerns actually run throughout his thought, even short essays that were not officially targeted towards it, like on a certain blindness of his life worth living. And indeed, there has been an explosion of recent works, I'm pleased to say, dealing with precisely this long neglected side. So in the last few years alone, we've had Clifford Stegall's Transforming Oneself, Todd Cairns, William James' The Moral Life, John Stewart's No Professor Lectures Can Save Us, Jacob Goodson's William James' Moral Philosophy in the Ethical Life, an essay compilation, Clifford Stegall and Levine's Pragmatism Applied, and Sarah Marchetti's The Jamesian Mind. We also had Alexander Livingston's Damn the Great Empires, goes to the politics of pragmatism, which demonstrates how James's politics were not only were fundamentally compatible and consistent with his pragmatism, but also that he came to them very passionately, albeit late in life, in the past decade and a half of his life, and in the struggle, in his anti-imperialist struggle, especially his opposition to the US enthusiasm for newly discovered enthusiasm for imperial annexations like that in the Philippines. So that notion that James is inappropriate because he just doesn't have much to say ethically, I think, is clearly a mistake. The second has, I think, been more generally as it applies to environmental issues. And this is the accusation that James's thought is fundamentally anti-naturalistic. I did deal with this actually at article length in a piece called The Turn of the Skew in Contemporary Pragmatic back in 2012. But I'll give you a quick and dirty summary here. There seem to be sort of two routes for this idea that James is an anti-naturalist. The first goes around Holmes Rolston's, sadly, Holmes died this past week, a wonderful inspirer of modern environmental ethics. But when his early 1980s reading, he gives a reading of the moral equivalent of war, which was rapidly accepted within environmental philosophy as being a demand for a moral war against non-human nature as such. But in fact, that is a long way from the case. James Rolston basically takes a couple of quotations out of context, one of which is not even from the moral equivalent of war, and fails to see the context of what James is talking about. What James is talking about is he is trying to deal with the dispute between militarists and pacifists. And his suggestion is that it's true on the militarist side that there are some important and reliable virtues that are promoted by war, although war is in all other respects appalling. And what concerns him is the need for a form of discipline that enables a sort of necessary instrumentalism. And he purports to do that, saying that there are certain necessary instrumentalisms that inundated with non-human nature. Now that's very different from saying that we should have a limitless war to humanize nature, that Rolston seems to mistakenly think James is calling for. In fact, what James was going for was essentially a recognition of both the light and the dark sides of our dealings with non-human nature. And in fact, he encourages his own sons to join the Forest Service precisely in order to get a taste of that sort of limited instrumentalism within nature experience. And moreover, that essay, in fact, inspired FDR's Civilian Conservation Corps during the New Deal era. Progressive accomplishment is marked and still found in America's national parks today. If you go to pretty much any of the great national parks, you'll see stuff there that was put there as a result of Civilian Conservation Corps during the 1930s. The second major offshoot of this, far from being anti-environmentalist, was President Jimmy Carter's response to the oil crisis and his pro-environmentalist speech in favor of energy conservation and greater frugality in the late 1970s, known as his moral equivalent of war speech. Now, this unfortunately was not accompanied by policies, and by that time the Carter administration was running out of steam in retrospect. But nonetheless, it was Carter who was the first and so far only president who has put solar panels on the White House, and was sufficiently concerned about this issue to look ahead and try and place America into a leadership role. So insofar as there are obvious payoffs from James's essay, they are actually very clearly pro-environmentalist payoffs rather than anti-environmentalist ones. And so that again is sort of state to see this as being a moral equivalent of war as ruling James's philosophy out for environmental purposes. Thirdly is James's perceived individualism as opposed to the greater collectivism associated with John Dewey. Now this criticism shares some ground with the idea that James is minimally political, but what's important to note here is that James's individualism is quite different from the sort of individualism that we would associate with the kind of people who invoke the takings clause to try and prevent environmental preservationist initiatives. It's quite different from the Lockean possessive individualist tradition. The Lockean tradition basically thinks of an individual as being a distinct and minimally permeable subject, basically a world of determinate objects. And it has an emphasis on equating the subject with their possessions, going back to Locke's labour theory of value and acquisition. And it grants special status to the freedoms attached to processes of acquisition. Jamesian individualism, wholly different from all of this, it's much more focused on being rather than having, much more focused on the self as relational. So quick to this. For James, although for all of us there's something in this that's only accessible to ourselves, the self is basically a relational self. At least it is at least as much or more of the thing. There's a recent book, Clifford Stigall, I think expressed it quite well, when he talks about this relationship between the self and other for James. He says, it might be right to say that James downplayed the role of the other in day-to-day living, contra Marx, Durkheim, Mead and Dewey, for example, but it would be very wrong to suggest that he conceived of the self as isolated from others. He doesn't just criticise theories of individual persons that assume a substantial self conducting life independently of the social world, but he champions the alternative idea of the private self as largely defined by relations with other people. Interpersonal conflicts, informal discussions, sexual relations, war, poverty, prejudice, familial expectations, social education, and so on, all play roles in determining one's interests, judgments, and actions. James considered that they influence our beliefs, decisions, and actions in the same way as other kinds of experience that influence, but over which we have limited control. So, Jamesian individualism is a type of individual that is in which the individual is not primordially separated from their environment. Rather, it is the case that experience is interactive and is, in James's words, remoulding us at every moment, and our mental reaction on every given theory is really a result of our experience of the whole world up to that date, principles of psychology. All our sensory flow as adults is a unified processive flow of consciousness in which we attend to what interests us on grounds of our purposes, interests, beliefs, past experiences. The doctrine of the stream of consciousness, later translated into the doctrine of empiricism, the notion of pure experience, is in radical empiricism, reflects this. Now, so the notion of the separative self and the acquisitive priorities that stem from the separative self that occur in the tradition of Locke is quite separate from the Jamesian notion of individualism, as indeed is the sensational atomism of the British empiricists from Locke to Mill. James, again, was striving to move himself away from. In fact, I published a piece a couple of years ago on Mill and James, the influences and tensions between them in the Jamesian reader. So the emphasis instead for James is on a primordial unity of immediate experience that subsequently gets broken up into selected foci that are both products and objects of our attention and interests. So we as he famously says, it's the generation of reality for us in consciousness is like carving a statue from the original mass of linked blurry sensations. I'm now going to take you to chapter 3. And this is where we want to rethink individualism, right? Having laid out the ways in which Jamesian individualism is not a threat to environmentalism in the way that Lockean individualism could be seen as being. I want to argue here a couple of points about this. First of all, that much of the importance of the self for James revolves around the idea of free will and moral agency. So improving and developing our agency occurs largely through training our habits. And he is very firm on this, particularly in the principles, interestingly enough. He thinks that our habits can function as sort of preperceptions, and if we choose them and develop them sensibly, they can help us make coherent sense of the world, and they can help us operate within it in ways that are useful for our own and others' flourishing. But good habits, of course, can become bad ones if the circumstances change. And so a really important aspect of human transformative capacity and freedom for James is what he calls genius, which is the habit of always being able to see an alternative. James describes this in terms of the power of highly sustained, highly focused and concentrated attention, active imagination, and novel association. So the capability, the relationship between will and attention is very significant for James there. So the ability to see outside your habits and be able to generate new ones is just as important as, or almost as important as being able to generate the good habits to begin with. So it says that the essential achievement of the will, in short, when it is most voluntary, is to attend to a difficult object and hold it fast before the mind. The so doing is the fact. Now, the exercising of the will is very important, and it reflects what Richard Gale calls the Promethean side of James. Gale divides James's thought into a Promethean and an anti-Promethean side. The Promethean side, he says, is essentially the attempt to use the will to establish moral agency against mere habit or instinct. The concentrated dynamic power of exercising non-free will. And we discover it through introspection. Now, introspection, of course, is a method that Dewey wound up abandoning in his attempts to update James, because Dewey desires quite different things from his pragmatism. Gale puts it, he says, whereas Dewey viewed the other person primarily as a co-worker in a cooperative venture to realize some shared goal, James wanted to I-thou this person, in fact, the universe at large. And this is really a fundamentally different orientation, because whereas Dewey wants to think in terms of plans and projects, the anti-Promethean James, his side, when he's in anti-Promethean mode, he wants precisely to engage and share in the direct experience of the other as far as possible. And the introspective method that Dewey rejects is central to that complementary anti-Promethean side of James's thought. James's radical empiricism here comes directly into play, I would suggest, for the importance of nature experience in defense of non-human nature in this regard. Because what James is inviting us to do via introspection and via, should we say, sensitive receptivity, a romantic sort of notion, is to try to think ourselves into the beings of the other. The more other they are, the more difficult it may be, but also the more enriching it may be. So, what does James mean there by this notion of experience and pure experience? Well, the division should not just be thought of as being a rigid conceptual distinction, because James is pretty clear that all of us as adults, all of our experiences are to some extent socially mediated through the preceding sets of analogies which we have internalized in consciousness. As he puts it, James is clear that only newborn babes or men in semi-coma from sleep, drugs, illnesses, or blows may be assumed to have an experience pure in the literal sense of a that which is not yet any different what. But the purity is, as he puts it, only a relative term, meaning the proportional amount of unverbalized sensation which it still embodies. But the relative purity is still important, because although Dewey spoke of immediate experience and seemed to mean something quite similar to James's pure experience, they applied this in quite different ways. Dewey primarily wants to get straight on with the social analysis of experience. But James's formulation and his emphasis on the I-thou allows us to say instead that while conceptual knowledge and instrumental categories certainly do overlay experience, they don't equally do so. To say that everything is social condition is not to say that everything is equally social condition. Certain types of experience can be more vivid, more original, more transformative. If you are receptive to them, they can fundamentally alter the way in which you view the rest of the world. And it's those sorts of transformative experiences which many environmentalists look to as being central to why they got into environmentalism to begin with, precisely to value that which is different different from us, which is not overlain with social categories and instrumental orientations. So in this respect, the relative purity of Jamesian pure experience is analogous to the relative naturalness of non-human nature. It may well say parts of nature that are totally untouched by human involvement, but it's nonetheless the case that doesn't mean they're all equally untransformed. There really is a difference between urban Chicago and the bottom of Mariana's Trench, and one can sensibly talk about these in relative terms of the relative purity of naturalism, and we can think of them as well as being on a spectrum rather than as they operate in experience, rather than in a simple duality. And moreover, James himself seems to have thought about nature very much along these lines. It's just that he didn't put it in front and centre of any of his essays, and he only references it, should we say, glancingly in a couple of them. He does, however, talk about it quite a bit in his correspondence. So let's start putting some of the pieces together here. First of all, by starting his epistemology with the doctrine of pure experience, James's individualism repudiates the Lockean possessive individualist tradition, emphasizes the embedded relationality of human experience and the ways in which the will in moral agency is dependent upon our attention, our novel associations, and the development of the imagination. These derive from James's introspective method, which we don't, and on that side, it both enables the Promethean orientation that takes us to novel moral initiative will, but it also touches upon the anti-Promethean side, the I-thou understanding of the other, an attempt to receptively engage with another in their deepest understandings. The most obvious, I think, probably the place for that is in certain blindness of human beings, where he really puts that element in primary focus. But in order to attain that sort of union, it's necessary for the agent, I'll quote here, to overcome his active Promethean self and learn to become passive, so that he could penetrate the inner consciousness of worldly objects through acts of conceptless, sympathetic intuition. Gale puts it, an orientation revealing James' assumption that the true nature of reality is to be ascertained not through the employment of symbols or concepts, but rather through personal experience. So from this regard, you can see the extent to which James is informed by aspects of the Romantic tradition, and indeed a number of scholars have, most notably Goodman, have pointed to the extent to which his thinking is basically romantically inflected. I would point out here, whenever you say romanticism, people almost always think of it in much the same way as certain critics think of James, as being it's all about woolly headed feelings and whatever he thinks. And no, romanticism was not meant that. Romanticism was meant, its target originally, if you look at thinkers like Goethe, was precisely to say that the rationalism of the Enlightenment had overcompensated, and that a proper, better balance between rationality and between reason and passions was needed. And of course, James himself actually repudiates the whole idea of conceiving of the mind as an embattled place between reason and passions. So it draws upon the sort of romanticism that many environmentalists are inspired by in talking about their experiences and their transformative experiences. But it also does certain other things. So in terms of the environmental, was it, let's skip one just a second. Yeah, so, whoops. Okay, so went through that one, sorry. So in terms of the environmental implications of a Jamesian philosophy, there are two sides here rather than merely one. Well, the general tendency of environmental pragmatists is to be stress action policy. The Jamesian approach basically says, well, no, you have to start from the other side. You start from the radical empiricist side. Introspective emphasis on relational experience and its richness can precede the appeal to policy action and in a way helps explain it. By initially trying to some extent, bracket the conceptual and instrumentalizing aspects of pragmatism, it connects to the romantic heritage of environmentalism. And moreover, it also touches upon, this also brings us close to the origins of eco-psychology. There is, in fact, although many environmentalists haven't really looked at it, there's a strong Jamesian input into eco-psychology. So James Gibson's ecological theory of perception, for example, and Roger Barker's work at similar that are both explicitly drawn from a Jamesian psychological heritage. Now, the reason why that's helpful is that it acknowledges and incorporates what so much contemporary environmental pragmatism leaves out, the centrality of types of radically non-instrumental, sensitive relational experience, of encountering surprise and difference, being unsettled by openness to the other, being oneself transformed accordingly, as the motive for environmental concern. Now, this doesn't itself overcome familiar paradox, what Neil Evenden called way back in the 90s the paradox of the dispassionate environmentalist, namely the paradox that in order to protect the world that gives us these experiences, the only way we have to engage with people in the language of instrumentality, and so in a certain sense contradict ourselves. It doesn't get us off that hook, but what it does do is to say, no, we can do both and not either or. So we don't have to just focus on action and policy. We can take the starting point as being the starting point of everyday individual experience, which and acknowledge its transformative capabilities. And that does not deny the possibility of actually going on and doing more. It simply says you can't leave out the start of the process. And secondly, I think one can read this in terms of the way in which it plays out in the will and what informs the will, in terms of both Promethean and anti-Promethean forms of Jamesian thought, as resonating with two different but complementary models of freedom in the individual and the political realm. So on the Promethean side, we can still use the familiar language of the will and of negative liberty in modern liberal thought, but that's taken as informed by and partially derived from a relational prior orientation that will involve a sympathetic and romantic receptivity to others in the world, at least sometimes. And that aspect is derived from the anti-Promethean James. So the relational aspect of self-construction through experience and its various transformations over time are stressed and can be thought of as providing support for conceptions of positive liberty to balance out the negative liberty. So the provision of opportunities and experiences that are conducive to the expansion of human capabilities, imagination and fulfillments. And that last notion opens us up to the possibility of linking the impacts of nature experience to the expansion of human potentiality and freedom. And this is a theme which James himself seems to have relished and one to which we'll now turn. Okay, too bad. Right. Now, in the recent essay, 2019, William James in the Woods, Douglas Anderson becomes the first person to devote a whole essay to James's engagement with American nature, particularly the New England woods, which he loved to go back to on a regular basis throughout his adult life, and which he found enormously restorative. Anderson partially addresses Gale's reading, and he argues that the divisions within James's personality were tensions that James successfully sought to reconcile by spending his time in the woods, with philosophy, for James, playing a role more suited to the originally informing visions of philosophy on helping how we should live and how we should maintain inner balance, rather than with the sort of fixations on language and science and method that dominated much 20th century philosophy. And Anderson invokes quite a lot from James's own words in his correspondence. I'll give just two quotations here. One is from a letter to his brother Henry, from who was spending time in Chocorua, where he says, "The physical luxury of the simplification, let's say, of living with nature, is something that money can't buy." And then later, when he's writing to Charles Renouvier, spending time in Keene Valley in 1883, he says, "I have been here myself just a week. The virgin forest comes close to our house, and the diversity of walks through it, the brooks and the ascensions of hilltops are infinite. I doubt if there be anything like it in Europe. Your mountains are grander, but you have nowhere this carpet of absolutely primitive forest, with its indescribably sweet exhalations, spreading in every direction unbroken. I shall stay here doing hardly any work till late in September. I need to lead a purely animal life for at least 2 months to carry me through the teaching year." Exactly. Now, it will be easy to multiply examples of those assertions like that from James. He says this over and over again in the letters. It's very strange that other environmental philosophers haven't picked up on this before, to be honest, because it really is. It's all over the correspondence. Whenever he heads off into New Hampshire or the woods, you get this stuff in his letters back. But I want to draw from Anderson's conclusion about the centrality of this for James's experience, and link it to some of the earlier work, much earlier interpretive work by Patrick Kieran-Dooley. So I'll get into that in a moment, but just a quick summary from Anderson, where he says, James does not say that everyone must turn to nature to engender these sorts of insightful experiences, but he makes it clear that for him, time in the woods creates a setting for meditative work and for the sort of receptivity that catalyzes his intellectual work. And in his case, solitude in the forests of the Adirondacks catalyzes his poetic abilities. Finally, we need to note here that James, as a radical empiricist, was a down-to-earth reporter of experience. He was not a glassy-eyed romantic. Right? For him, these kinds of experiences in nature are quite common to the general run of the human animal, even if they elude or are intentionally ignored by contemporary professional philosophers. And I would reassert, I would certainly agree with Anson on that. And in fact, if you read more of James's correspondence, he quite frequently recommends to people, if they're worn down, if they're sort of like run down, get out into nature, right? Get away from all of this political instrumentalizing stuff, right? Policy stuff, and allow yourself basically to be reconnected. As famously, he says this, for example, in a couple of letters to Pauline Goldmark at considerable length. So, in other words, James did this himself as a form of rebalancing. And also as a manifestation of trying to make himself, and by implication guide to others, make themselves whole, when he was torn between his various parts, both anti-Promethean and Promethean, and the various other paradoxes which James, like most of us, had it within their lives. So that notion of rebalancing, I would suggest, and the idea of an earlier form of philosophical practice about trying to guided by how one lives one's life, fits well with the older reading by Patrick Kieran-Dooley. And Dooley maintained that one of the key points in James's philosophy is that it's centrally informed by a regulative ideal of the whole person. That involves a balance of rational and emotional faculties. I'll give a quote here. I'll apologize in advance for the sexist language. This is because it was written in 1974. Sorry. He says, James uses the term whole man as a caution against the adoption of an artificially narrow concept of man. He argues, for example, if our notion of man is based only upon a consideration of man's practical experiences, we will distort our notion of man. James then holds that an adequate notion of mind must take into account all the various forms of mental activity. Hence, when James refers to the demands or exigencies of the experiences of the whole man, he has in mind a notion of man which includes all the desires and interests, be they practical, aesthetic, ethical, or religious. Hence, the whole man is James's way of referring to his position that the totality and variety of human experiences must be incorporated into an adequate conception of man. So, to conclusion, bringing these multiple interpretive perspectives together, we've got the germs of a synthesis between Anderson's observations and Dooley's, one in which nature experience could be seen as both a liberatory and a philosophically significant element to much human development and flourishing. And as I've already suggested, it can be thought of as suggesting the value of nature as operating in a way that enriches, expands, and can inform the operations of human freedom. And that really is, in terms of the book project so far, that's kind of as far as it's largely worked out. But this is where I want to go over to you, because where to next? I have several ideas as to how I can develop this. For anyone who doesn't know, I also do work on the James's side, but it connects up as well in some work I do in political philosophy, where I try and square environmental protection with the core values of a kind of million liberalism. Let's say a form of liberalism that has both positive and negative liberties, and which resists economic reductionism. So the sort essentially was associated with the New Deal in the United States, and with the post-war consensus in the UK. So chapter 5, there are several ways in which I could develop this. I could have more than one further chapter. In fact, I'd be interested in your own advice on this, both you present and online. So I could do it this way. I could try and cash out the pragmatic value of nature into liberty orientations and political philosophy. Or a second option to develop it is to explore the implications of the pragmatic naturalist perspective for exploring and explaining the ontology of non-human nature. I have done an article on that years ago, but what defines nature and human experience? Why does it matter as against the artifactual? Why does it have these restorative effects? Thirdly, there's possible pragmatic ecologism, a critique of our contemporary times, the attention economy, coming back to our senses and to non-human nature, could be a healing path forward in ethics, politics, and political practice. And that would tie in with a lot of the work that's coming on at the moment. There's moral and political critiques of the attention economy and what it appears to be doing basically to our heads and our capacities for mental health. And a fourth one, which I could take, which I forgot to write here, is the possibility of cashing out the notion of value in relation to essentially across biology, right? So we could think in terms of the evolution of consciousness, in terms of initial primordial value, which is the receptivity of living organisms to their environment, and then I would take it into the notion of valuing, right, which can be which requires at least a movement into something more like consciousness, values, which would require levels of abstraction, and that would take us basically into the human realm, where values are primarily a mixture of socially and biologically constructed for general fulfillment. And finally, there would be evaluation, which would be dealing with second order desires and a morality of the more, should we say, mature type. That's a fourth option, but I'm open to your suggestions as to where I should pick it up and take it from here. Yes, please do. Yeah.
Before I give my thoughts, I'm wondering how many chapters you're thinking of having for this book.
Well, I'm thinking in terms of 5, but I could make it 6.
Okay.
Yeah. I've oscillated between 5 and 6. Yes.
That helps. That helps a lot, because I think all these ones that you have suggested are good directions forward, but that's also going to be strongly determined by what you have already written.
Exactly.
Because what you have already leads into all of those perfectly. I also thought something, if you to connect all of them together.
Yeah.
That might be a good way to.
Were you ready to move to Q&A now?
Sure. Yeah.
Oh,
Absolutely. Yeah.
just wanted to make sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's something else to consider is if there are threads in what you've suggested that connects,
Right.
as well as what you've already written.
Right.
One thing that stood out to me,
Yes.
that I would like clarify first is what do you mean by environmentalism? Are we talking generally broadly as a whole, or are we talking about specific positions environmentalists take?
Right. Okay.
And in the specific positions they take could determine into the 5th and 6th chapter in terms of practical application.
Right. Yes.
Because I get the impression that's where you're wanting to go.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I suppose what my basic thoughts on this are twofold in terms of what I think of as being definitive of environmentalism. I guess I would point to two or three basic orientations. One of these is the belief that a life lived in at least some connection with non-human nature is important for human flourishing and is endangered by the contemporary fixations of the growth economy. I would see that as being important there. So from that point of view, what one might call it the do not live by bread alone principle, right? I would say that that's a central point of environmentalism. I think a second related notion is the thought that one of the important aspects of that experience of that growth potential is precisely that the non-human nature in question is not designed for us, or at least it's not designed to us solely for our use, right? I mean, if you think of many indigenous perspectives, for example, on human nature, it's not that they don't deny there's difference. What they deny is that there's a sort of categorical qualitative difference whereby whereby the rest of the biosphere is just supposed to exist for our economic use. Their notion is that we belong with rather than that we have inordinate control over. And I would say that that's that something like that is an important component to environmentalism. And I would also say, I suppose my third point there would be recognition of scarcity. That extinction is probably forever. I mean, sometimes it might not be with the extinction technologies, but one should work on the principle that it probably is. Because we don't know otherwise, and under those circumstances, just in the everyday pragmatic sense, of what decisions to make, one ought not to break something that one doesn't know how to repair. So, thank you. Yeah.
I have a couple of suggestions, one about 2 and one about 3.
Sure.
On the 2, looking at James's relationship with Bergson as he was developing, I mean, James was not a talented ontologist, but Bergson was, and a good bit of James's ontology in the radical empiricism period is drawn from stuff he liked in Bergson. How closely he studied it is not super clear, but it looks like he definitely read Matter and Memory and Time and Free Will. Whether he ever read Creative Evolution, I do not know, but it doesn't matter because the ontology is in those other 2 books. So, and there's an interesting correspondence between the 2 of them about just these things. And so one of the things that would lead you into is process philosophy.
Right.
And so exploring the ontology of non-human nature, something that process philosophers have done a lot of. So the ecological civilization movement. However, most of the people who are talking about that also don't really read Bergson. And so Pete Gunner is somebody you could look at for this. And of course, he was Gene Hargrove's colleague down there, and they started that program at North Texas together.
Right.
and Olslager and even Joe Barnhart, so that sort of first generation down in North Texas of environmental philosophers, there was a lot of process philosophy in there. I don't think they talked about James very much. But what I do know, I knew Gene Hargrove when all that was first coming on, and he didn't know anything about pragmatism. He was miseducated by analytic philosophers, and had not in 1989 studied, and so this is the point about three. What he says about Gifford Pinchot there is partial at best.
Yes.
And the idea of somehow identifying Pinchot with pragmatism is another.
Yes.
I think Pinchot was a pragmatist, but if that's your path to treating pragmatists as a bunch of instrumentalists, but that's the way Gene thought, and that he got better.
Yes.
As he became educated. But in any case, Pinchot is somebody worth revisiting on your third point.
Right.
And here's the simple side of that. His argument in the Battle for Conservation, and of course there's the connection of James. He knew Pinchot, and he wanted his. It was Pinchot's ideas that led him to say, you guys, to his sons, you should enter the Forest Service.
Right.
Pinchot was the founder of the Forest Service. And so anyway, if you read Battle for Conservation, the argument is that, and Rorty said as much later, democracy rides on the back of prosperity.
Yeah.
And without conservation, you can't have prosperity. And so therefore, conservation and democracy are exactly the same thing.
Right. Yeah.
That's the argument of that book, that there is no democracy without conservation, and there is no democracy that doesn't mean conservation.
Right. Yeah.
So it's quite a subtle and sophisticated argument that goes on for 6 or 7 chapters about how tightly interwoven. He doesn't use the word prosperity. That's the one that Rorty used later to describe the situation. But Pinchot understood that where people don't have enough, they give in to the strong man.
Yeah.
And that's what he wanted to. I mean, he's a Theodore Roosevelt kind of democracy person. So anyway, but it connects to James because it connects to political practice in a way. So if you go back to Pinchot, you have a way. So you're not going to get it from James.
Sure.
But if you go back into Pinchot, and of course Pinchot and Peirce were like this as well, and so. Pinchot was basically taking care of Peirce in his last days, as James was too. But anyway, you can connect to the pragmatist tradition by looking at how James and Pinchot interacted, and you can get some really powerful ideas that are still relevant out of Pinchot.
That's right.
And so Hargrove was just wrong. I mean, he's right that there are a lot of doctrines that come out through the Forest Service and things like that that look like instrumentalism.
Yeah.
But at the time that Gene was writing that stuff, the Forest Service was what had to be opposed because of the way it had developed. Certainly wasn't Pinchot's Forest Service anymore by that point. And in fact, Gene was right. The Forest Service has to be opposed. It still has to be opposed. That's not Pinchot's fault, and it's not pragmatism's fault. No. So anyway, there's good ideas in there. Is what I'm saying for your number 3, and there's this intimate connection between pragmatism and Pinchot through the personal relationships of James and Peirce to Pinchot.
Yeah, that's really interesting because of because I have actually written a chapter a few years ago on James's, I think it's pretty clear, James's influence on Leopold. And it is actually a direct influence. It's not just via secondary sources, as Brian Norton argues. We know that Leopold read James, and he even paraphrased him in a couple of places. And he's the only pragmatist whom Leopold explicitly quotes, and we know that he read, which makes it all the more odd that everyone just sort of instantly goes to Dewey, because I mean, okay, Dewey was a significant figure by the time Leopold died, but not at the time he was first harvesting putting his thoughts together. So that's helpful to see in the there. I mean, curiously enough, back in 2012 when I wrote my piece and on the various misunderstandings of pragmatism, and particularly in relation to James, I did I the section on Hargrove. I also had a section on Horkheimer's Eclipse of Reason, which similarly travesties pragmatism. And another section on Ralston, as I touched upon here, on Ralston's treatment. But interestingly, I did actually get an email from Gene Hargrove after I read that, and he basically sort of he kind of deflected the pragmatism of it and said, "Well, I think you're being entirely fair because I'm quite nice to James about radical empiricism elsewhere in the book," which is true. But I was talking there about the broad brush condemnation of pragmatism, which isn't.
Well, he just got that from his analytic training, and it got softer and softer the longer he lived.
Yeah,
So.
yeah. Well, I know the sort of well, of course. I mean, I first started engaging with pragmatism when I was still on the other side of the Atlantic, and of course the tradition there is, particularly in those days, back in the 1990s. I mean, it's shifted since, but there was overwhelmingly an ahistorical, analytic way of doing philosophy that was predominant in most British universities at the time. I should say that it wasn't everyone. I had my friends and allies, but nonetheless, it did make it incredibly difficult, for example, just to get anyone to take James seriously, because they would read everything back through the lens of starting epistemology with subject-object division. And then, of course, if you're going to do that, if you're going to leave out all the relational stuff and leave out the entire reconstruction of empiricism, then James, someone who wants to talk about religious experience, for example, well, I mean, they're just going to look chronically confused. So of course you're going to wind up with a straw man image of what this philosopher says, because you're historically misunderstanding. You're not seeing either the era or the problems that have been trying to be solved.
Questions or comments?
Are there any questions online?
Not so far. I have asked for them, but not yet. I mean, my view on these questions, Piers, is that definitely ending in the political would be helpful.
Right.
Obviously, I understand your point that many of the environmental pragmatists move too quickly to the policy realm,
Yes.
right? And that maybe that leads them to a rather thinner conception of environmentalism than you want. But it strikes me that one of the problems, in my opinion, of the sort of the environmental philosophy project that you began with, this sort of moralistic project,
Yes.
is the rather ineffective politics that it generates, right?
Yeah.
And so maybe there's a promise here of in that way. I don't know what you think about that.
No, I mean, I think that one has to. I think one of the reasons why pragmatism, as I've said, sort of like switches off a lot of environmentalists is that, I mean, well, the label itself, of course, is unfortunate. James himself admitted as much that it was, an invitation to be misunderstood. But I mean, I think a lot of them simply, they think of it as as being an invitation to a management theory seminar, which is really unfortunate. But I do, I think the way to try and get around that is to talk about the breadth of human experience, and the depth of these things, not in a way that can appeal to people directly without necessarily having to be overly theoretical. I mean, for instance, if you if you make your campaigns about highly theoretical notions, or for that matter, if you make them solely about, get yourself boxed into thing that it's just about allowing a lot of overeducated white people to go to wilderness areas, right? Which is the stereotype which quite a lot of people hold, right, of American environmentalism, right? If you look in those terms, then of course you're not going to make much impact. But if, on the other hand, you say, but each experience from this point of view, it's about things like being able to take your kids to the local park. It's about things like understanding where your food comes from, and knowing that it's safe to eat. It's about all of these direct things, which on the one hand, yes, they can fulfill you, they can give you all kinds of relief and trigger and support for your mental health and all of these valuable things. At the same time, that's actually pretty much everybody. It's not just overeducated white people who want that. Most people want those things, even if they're not accessing them every day or every month. They want them to be there. You know, and that I think is something that does need to be to be connected up to. And that's one of the reasons why I connected to liberty as well, is that I do think just more broadly on both sides of the Atlantic, that it has been quite disastrous over the past 30, 40 years that so much of the liberalism and the left has basically allowed the economic reductionists to completely control the language of liberty, which is, in the United States especially, is the master key language for politics, right? And we've got to fight back against that. That needs to be reversed, right? You need to say, well, whose liberties, which liberties, and if they're just reducing to let billionaires do whatever they like, well, it's not much liberty for the rest of us. Yeah, so, you know. Sorry, I thought you, yes, like, yeah.
Yes, I was just throwing up my hand.
Oh, see, right,
Thinking that you picked a hell of a time
right.
to launch
Yeah.
this project in this political environment.
Yes,
Here right
yes.
now. Everything seems to be going the opposite direction, and yet,
Yes.
of course, it's,
Yeah.
I mean, part of your political solution, and if you go in the direction number 3, needs to be finding a language, a mode of expression that would cut through the rather self-centered economic liberalism to draw people and encourage people back to a more complete experience of themselves and nature together. This doesn't, how one starts a conversation like that when the National Park Service is being decimated.
Yeah.
When the saddest thing I ever read was the story of one park ranger who had just been fired Monday.
Yes, I think I read that myself.
I read
Yes.
that. Yeah, I read that.
Yes.
Yeah, it was all over the internet and just tragic. Yeah. So good luck to you.
I wanted to follow up on what Dr. Brown was saying about policy and politics, the
Right,
language
yes.
of that, because that's sort of what I was thinking. I also found it interesting to juxtapose environmentalists as moralists, when environmental policy is almost always, in how I understand it and how I see it all over on social media, and what I consume as strictly a we should protect the environment because it's in your economic interest to.
Yeah.
And I think following that thread of what would a Jamesian policy look like? What does that sound like? I think that's something that connects with all these different points that you're bringing up.
Right. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
One of the viewers online asked about the role of imagination. Is there a significant role for imagination in environmental critique?
Oh, I think so, very much so, and I think this is one of the elements of the sort of anti-Promethean side and the radical empiricist side, that if you one of the reasons why James wanted, and many environmentalists would like to get out and just sort of switch off for a few days, is precisely that that is when the imagination can be enabled. And one of the reasons I would argue, and indeed I have argued, that there are reasons for this, right? Which is basically this: when we are living in the modern world, we are living surrounded by and conditioned by excesses of instrumental rationality. It is concretized into our technology. It is predominant in our policy. It is presupposed in our economics. That simply is the way to orientate yourself, right? But something interesting happens if you get out of that, and if you spend time in nature. And I would say that how is it that people so frequently find that their imaginations are restored by spending time in nature. James references it, but it's not just James. I mean, there is, for example, a small history of philosophy to be written, right? Merely around the relationship between philosophy and walking. How many of the major philosophers and poets have been avid walkers, right? Nietzsche said sort of like he mistrusted any thoughts that didn't come from walking, right? Unless you're actually engaging with the world as you move along, right? You're probably atrophying behind a desk, right? Now that, as usual with Nietzsche, might be sort of like a studied exaggeration, but nonetheless, the impulse behind it, I think, has a lot of truth in it, which is that you need to be engaged with something that is non-instrumental and that is other than you, that does not exist solely for you, that will get by perfectly well once you're gone, and so on, in order to get yourself out of thinking this way that surrounds us. And in some of my other writings, I've made the point that I don't think it's accidental from this point of view, that if you see the explosion of dystopian literature we've had in the 21st century, and indeed the 20th century, the great dystopias of the 20th century, what do you find time and time again? You find time and time again the ethos of a technified, instrumentalized, radically politicized human existence in which the only resistance can come from a point outside the system of instrumental rationalities. Right? So Yevgeny Zamyatin's We, right, the totalitarian sort of city in one state, is kept out from, they keep nature out with a great glass wall, right, and the rebels are going to connect up to are outside. Orwell's 1984, right? The key moments in it occur in the Golden Country. Right? The three basically is dreaming Julia, meeting her there, and then reminiscing about it just before the final collapse of his individuality in Room 101. The Huxley's Brave New World, everything is completely magnificent, except but the drama only begins when they bring someone in from a savage reservation, where they come from nature. Fahrenheit 451, much the same thing. Montag finds his way out to the book people in the forest, right? And that notion goes further back as well. So if you go into pre-modern era, you'll find that the notion of the forest as being the corrective to the excesses of instrumental rationality and politicking. It is a consistent theme. It was known to the Romans. You find it in Shakespeare with the Forest of Arden and in A Midsummer Night's Dream. Even in Macbeth, right? I mean, Macbeth is the ambitious tyrant, right? It's also like, how long will I last? And the witch has said, well, till Burnham would come till Dunstane, which of course he reads as being, okay, well, I'm good forever then, because that's not going to happen. And oh, look, there's Macduff's army, and they're wearing. So the forest has come to reclaim and rectify the tyranny of manipulation. So that I think it runs deep, and you find images like this not just in the West. There is, for example, a tradition in India of associating, very similar to Robin Hood, of associating forest bandits with liberation.
I want to add to that, since there's a lot of literature noted, it's not just outside, it's the memory of the woods, because that's a core aspect in The Giver.
Yes, that's a good point. Yes.
Right,
yes.
as well as even in the Hunger Games, if you want to bring in some more contemporary dystopian literature, it's the protagonist has a direct connection to the woods that she would not have had otherwise if her lived experience did not require her to have to go into the woods and be the sole provider for her family. Right. It's not just the outside, it's the memory of it. It has that direct connection.
Exactly.
You remember that in Vico, the forest is what comes between civilizations. But your book that you called for, the little book, that was written by John Kaag about 4 years ago. It's called Hiking with Nietzsche.
Ah, right.
Yeah. It's from a very sort of a personal point of view, but of course it's philosophy, and there's a lot of William James in it as well. And I don't know whether you saw his book, How to Save Your Life.
I read the reviews of it. I've read his.
I have to be honest with you, his style is not for me, but but it is for a lot of people, and it does take up the environmentalism, especially the hiking with Nietzsche does.
Yes.
So,
Yeah, I mean I loved his book, American Philosophy.
yeah, that book was a little stylistically a little bit easier for me to put up with, but but it's a little too much Henry Bugby.
Right.
These other two books. And it's like I'm not as inward as that.
Well,
I want the outward more, not the inward more.
Well, I was actually able to enjoy reading his American Philosophy, a love story, while I was doing a train drive across coast to coast from San Francisco to New York.
Oh,
back
yeah,
in
that'd be a
2017.
good.
Yeah, this is really good
That.
companionship. Yeah. So.
Isn't the view you end up with in chapter 4 really a kind of instrumentalism, if we understand instrumentalism properly, right? I'm thinking of the sort of polemic that Dewey makes in Experience in Nature, and then repeats in Art as Experience, that what we tend to call useful is in fact detrimental, and if we appreciate the sort of breadth and depth of human experience, right, we come to call very different things useful. You know, you describe the nature experience as something that's significant to human development and flourishing, right?
Yeah.
Isn't that instrumentalism?
I think there's an important paradox there, which can be resolved by reference to the anti-Promethean side of James, which is roughly this: you can only acquire. You can't, paradoxically, you can't acquire that end by thinking of it as an end to acquire. Right? Let me give you an example of this. Many of my students have heard this story because it's just such a piece and actually happened to me. Years ago, when I was still living in Britain, there's a little sort of sanctuary wood near Liverpool, formerly near Liverpool, which is preserved by the National Trust, and it's for indigenous red squirrels, because red squirrels are the original squirrels in Britain, and then North American greys were introduced at the start of the 20th century, and they started to outcompete the reds, right? Anyway, this particular area is deliberately, basically, life is deliberately made easy for the reds and difficult for the greys in terms of the habitat. So you can go there and you can. But the interesting thing is that although they're reasonably confident, they are naturally shy creatures. They don't have the sort of, in-your-face gutsiness that grey squirrels often have, right? They tend to be rather reserved, and there are a lot of national jokes about that. Actually, never seen it.
It sounds like the history of the 20th century.
But the interesting thing is that I went there with a friend, and what you need to do, it's very Jamesian fashion, right? If you want to, is you need to sit down and basically wait for and be calm and be patient and let them come to you as and if and where when they wish, right? And that. Now we had a nice time, and then we were just leaving. And I heard this lady who was just it was also just leaving, and she sort of had a camera. She was there, and she said, "Oh, it's so frustrating. They won't stay still to be photographed." Now, why did you say that? Why? Because she has come there with an instrumental orientation. She has come there, she has come to a place where what you should be doing is engaging in open encounter. She's come there with a consumptive, consumerist, instrumentalizing mindset that I want to come away with a set of trophies. And from that point of view, if you categorize your experiences with the squirrels in advance as being under that rubric, you will wind up categorizing them, as she does clearly, as a sort of defective consumer good. So so you need to. The only way you can attain the instrumental end is by not approaching it in an instrumental way. And so from that point of view, I think you have to start with this anti-Promethean aspect. And if we say, well, it comes back to the instrumental in the end, No, it doesn't. If you leave out the non-instrumental aspect, you won't get the instrumental good. Right. And there are a lot. I mean, okay, it's particular. I think it's particularly the case with nature because we are, we are also accustomed to treating nature just as a kind of consumer good. That it's not easier to think of instances where we shouldn't use people in certain ways than it is to think of ways in which we certainly use nature in certain ways. But the basic principle is the same. If someone, if someone professes to be friends with you and then loses all interest in you when you're on a bad time, they aren't really a friend. They were just there to they thought they could get out of you. Now they can't get anything; they're not interested. The same principle applies. If you start with the instrumental orientation and say that's all there is to it, then oddly enough, the world is actually going to deny you even the instrumental satisfaction of seeking. So I do think it's important to keep that bracketing in place at the early stage.
Of course, Matt's point is that instrumentalism is not reductive, not really. But at least Dewey's isn't.
Yeah.
But after Habermas's critique of instrumental rationality, you might as well give up on the word instrument.
No, fair enough.
He saves that piece of Dewey under the heading of praxis and human interest,
Right.
and then says everything else is instrumental rationality, and so you end up losing the word instrument.
Yeah.
As a usable word after Habermas.
No, I granted that the contemporary uses of the word. So I just think I like what you said. I just think all of that is completely consistent with the view that Dewey calls instrumentalism.
Right. Okay.
For better or worse.
Yeah, but I think you're right about that. But I think the word is just gone.
Right.
Never going to reclaim the word.
So, yeah.
Um,
All right. Good. Any other comments, questions? All right. I think nothing else from
Coffee is calling.
our virtual audience. So please join me in thanking Piers Stevens.
Thank you very much.